Welcome everyone. I have the honor to introduce our speaker today. My name is Fiona Schrading, and I introduce Fiona Schrading, who joins us today from Düsseldorf, Germany, and where she's currently working at the Academy of Arts as a research associate with a project on wasteland, rural areas as effective space in cultural education as pedagogy of situate. So prior to this, she worked as a research assistant at the Institute for Media and Cultural Studies in Düsseldorf on the topics of queer feminist materialism, media ecology, the Anthropocene, and conceptions of the living, as well as post and decolonial theory. She holds a master's in media and cultural studies from the Heinrich Heine University Düsseldorf. She also studied in Vienna. She is an associate member of the DFG Research Training Group Aesthetics Practice at the University of Hildesheim, a member of the Working Group on New Materialism at the University of Cologne, and a member of a research collective called, I like this one, Composting International, also at the University of Cologne. The talk today is part of her PhD project entitled Practices of Relocalizing Past and Future in the Anthropocene, in which he is exploring how time can be understood as a practice and how caring practices of time are possible in times of climate crisis, species extinction, and neocolonialism. Her publications include a version of this talk in this drawing. If you read German, you can have a look at this. So published in German in an edited volume, Queer Feminist Composting of the Anthropocene, that Fiona co-edited as a member of the writers section of the Composting International. The title of that essay was Afterlife, about the irreversibility of non-past pastimes. Other publications include Staying with the Destroyed Traces and Ruined Grounds of the Anthropocene, Commoning the Future, about the questions of a common future in the Anthropocene, and The Touch of the Sense, an ecotechnology of touching after John Knossi. Fiona has also translated a number of articles from English into German, including one by myself. Yeah. And without further ado, Fiona's talk today is titled Undoing Time in the Anthropocene. Welcome, Fiona.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really kind introduction. And yeah, thank you especially for giving me the opportunity to talk here today. I really want to thank General Center for Study of Life Science and also the Global Systems Institute, because they both made it possible for me to be here today and supporting me in coming here and talking to you today. And as you maybe already heard from Astrid, I'm really working in a interdisciplinary field of media culture studies. So my perspective on the Anthropocene today is also really it's really influenced by my question of how an undoing time might be thought. So I think there are probably many ways to talk about how time matters and can come to matter in the Anthropocene. And maybe you all have different perspectives on this topic, and I would like to discuss it later with you. And my perspective today is really influenced by this question of undoing time, and I want to shortly say something about what this notion might mean. So for me, there are two things that are important. The first thing is that I understand it as somehow an intervention in a progressive linear time that moves forward into an open future, leaving the past behind, and how this intervention can be thought. And the second point is how can we readdress time in a way that it's not always this underlying of time always out of reach, like beyond or before the happening of worlds, but how can we readdress it as a really material political matter?
Yeah, click onto it, it should work.
Wait.
Should be added.
Yeah. Okay, I got it. Yeah, so my question of undoing, I just brought here two quotes from Latour and from Barat. And from Barat is also this quote of how can we undo concepts of temporality that take progress as something inevitable, like and leaving the past behind. And there's also one quote from Latour because I'm inspired by Latour, but also in asking about this undoing time, the Anthropocene, it's not my aim that I want to like undo or declare an end to progressive linear time and propose something like a new time, like moving beyond it. And Bruno Latour has prominently proposed the concept of something like a modern time or modernist time, which is time like an irreversible era of time that moves forward to an open future, and abolishing the past behind is something that is no longer active and ceaselessly enact like a difference between the past and the present. And so Latour argues that the moderns ceaselessly produce like a radical detachment from the past and making it sure that nothing of this past lives on, like it's not allowed to live on, and it's this progress into this open future. So, and he also links this to other binary distinctions and separation processes and operations of modernity, like distinction between nature and culture, facts and values, subject, object, discourse and matter. But he says that this modern time is now about collapsing Anthropocene. That's his diagnosis. So he says it is a time of time that has passed. Because in the Anthropocene, and even the human becomes geological, he says it is impossible to maintain modern divisions between nature and culture. And also the modernization project is collapsing, and also this idea of flow of time that has only one direction. And even though I'm sympathizing with this Latour's project of trying to travel time, I'm also critical about this gesture of declaring some time potentially to be over, because this would be also a gesture of like leaving behind and declaring something new. And so that's why I'm talking about this weird undoing time as maybe a critical practice to not leaving it behind, but to rework time. And also because I think this grasping time is still very much in power and effective also in some parts of the Anthropocene debates, which I want to show in my first part. But before I come to the first part, I just want to start with some introductory remarks about the Anthropocene concept. I don't know, you probably all heard about this concept, but maybe it's, I didn't know who will come and what kind of crowd I will have, so I just prepared some introductory remarks for you. So in the last 20 years, it's really becoming a much debated and really controversially debated term in the science and humanities, but also in the arts and also in the public space. And as you probably know, it was proposed by Paul Woods and Eugen Stürmer in the year 2000 as a maybe possible name for a new geological epoch on Earth for a, quote, age of humans, as environmental scientist Earl Ellis calls it, that characterize the fact that the human itself becomes something like a global geological force in its own right. And it's literally inscribing itself into the Earth, like producing a geological layer that is being formed by current activities of whole of humanity, which will still be served in the distant future. So the Anthropocene findings show us that we are living on a damaged planet in the midst of a global ecological catastrophe. So they show the extent to which human impacts have profoundly altered and changed, again, on a global level, like, and including all different kinds of phenomena, not only global climate change and its consequences, but also other phenomena like changes in the biosphere, both on land and the sea, and accelerated extinction of number of species, and the accelerated loss of biodiversity, and a lot more. And all these diagnoses add up to the result that, quote, human activities have become so pervasive and profound that they rival the great forces of nature, pushing the Earth into planetary terra incognita, as Will Woodson and Will Steffen, Paul Woodson and John McNeil write. And this proposal of the Anthropocene was taken up by geology, and they are discussing Anthropocene working groups since 2009. The conditions and stratigraphic conditions how to formalize the Anthropocene really as an official geological epoch. And in 2019, they also wrote today the beginning of the Anthropocene in the mid-20th century. But the Anthropocene is also more than this new geological epoch, and also more than a synthesis term for all the ecological catastrophes, because it's also debated as something like a diagnosis of the presence, like a way to maybe creating a new narrative about humans and nature, for example, or maybe a form to describe how we can live on a damaged planet. There has been wide-ranging debates what it means to tackle this new narrative of human natures. So what it means to be human, or what this new story of how we become into this mess maybe imply, and also what it might be obscuring, and what it also maybe excludes also. So in this debate, the Anthropocene is an ambivalent term in the sense that on the one hand, it marks the irreversible destruction of many life forms, and phenomena also arise from the centuries-long workings of colonial, extractive, nuclear, and capitalist processes. So they Anthropocene marks these phenomena, but on the other hand, in focusing on something like a universal concept of the human, it also simultaneously covers up and denies also the coloniality and anti-blackness that's inscribed into also the Anthropocene time. And is in this way also not capable of accounting for past and current imperial injustice, as for example, geographer Academy Düsseldorf and philosopher Exeter critique among others. So, for example, that a debate about when the Anthropocene began is also linked to its conditions of emergence through historical racialized violence. For example, the dates proposed to mark the beginning of the Anthropocene show that there's really materially inscribed in the Anthropocene also racialized violence. For example, the beginning of the Anthropocene, which is dated in the mid-century, starting with the geochemical signal of the first atomic bombing on the Trinity test site in 1945, as it's currently proposed, also makes clear that this Anthropocene boundary is related to also a violent history of nuclear colonialism, for example, as also Academy points out. So because after that, more than 2,000 nuclear bombs have since been dropped on areas where mostly indigenous communities are living. It's just one example. So coming back to the ambivalences, on the one hand, it's also seen as a really powerful new concept where we can also challenge like in a new way the divisions of modern thought structure, like the binaries between nature, culture, and human, non-human, non-living. So it's really sparking also these discussions about how we can maybe move beyond an anthropocentrism, or even maybe have a political concept for like saying goodbye to modernity, as for example Latour proposed it. But on the other hand, it's also reinstalling this man as a central actor, and also there are also proposals for new anthropocentrism, new recentering of the human. So just to give you some examples for this like really ambivalent debate. And so in a sense, they are showing more than one Anthropocene and linked to really divergent interests, and you can assemble and take it apart differently. But I want to highlight in the first part of my talk about the Anthropocene time, which is coming now soon, that it's not a neutral concept, and it has also consequences how you approach it. So there are a lot of critiques that have consistently pointed out that it also can serve as a universalizing paradigm, as for example, Metis anthropologists, so Todd notes, it also often denies also the racial dimension of the Anthropocene, and that the politicization of the Anthropocene also requires to refuse to lose sight of those for whom the Anthropocene and also some apocalyptic imaginary which it produces do not necessarily hold any emancipating value. This was a quote from Exeter. So, and I'm, as also a white academic speaking from in Europe, I'm certainly also implicated in this problem as the Anthropocene as a white discourse. So in my first part of the talk now, I want to also argue against some of the hegemonic tendencies of turning Anthropocene into something like a universal paradigm and a seemingly progressively inclusive age of human that can help maybe also make only one world possible. And I want to flesh out that in the sense that the Anthropocene can be also enacted like this call to move into a better future and leaving the past behind. It also risks reinstalling something like a planet history or something like a planet humanity. And in the second part, I want to change perspective and ask about how could an undoing time be even possible? So, and why should we just be intervene in this progressive linear time? And how could time be thought as something that can be done differently? And how would a different relation to the past be possible, which is not a relation of like this binary cutting off and binary decision between a cut between past and present. And so and then to approach this question, I want to follow two reflections of two different thinkers who try to think the past differently as something that is not finished and that's still going on, but also as something that is not recoverable in a sense, but also still not cut off. So Anthropocene time, I would have put yeah, just there's one quote you maybe know from Fiona Schrading. So yeah, as I stated, there are more than one Anthropocene, but there's also this underlying core idea that we humans or humanity has become this global geological force. So that's really also inscribed into the Anthropocene narratives and overwhelms something like great forces of nature, as for example, Will Stephen Hawkins and John McNeill also write, or like we see here, the diagnosis of that this long-held religious and philosophical idea, humans as masters of planet Earth, the second part here, has turned into a stark reality. What we do now affects the planet of the year 3000 or even 50,000. So this transformation from human into this non-negotiable, like stark reality of masses, cultural theorist Jakob worries, among others, can also override vast amounts of critical work that has done a lot of work to dismantle this false essentialism of the human. So she and many other critiques have already examined the extent to which the Anthropocene can also lead to this realization of this depoliticized and universal concept of man that obscures also the violent production of this man to also the exclusion of others that are marked as not non-human or less than human or inhuman. So the seemingly inclusive we in the Anthropocene is in this sense also a gesture of a rupture of like cutting off the violent history of man. And this we, as Jakob, for example, describes it, also produces a break from the past, like cutting off this violent history of man and arriving as this new, better we human, and regaining humanity in this better we. And also there are some theorists like the historian Dinesh Chakrabarty who formulate something like maybe new collectivity of human who can understand itself as a species in the face of this shared catastrophe. But this we of a species being also implicates something like an undifferentiated and uncomplicated inheritance, for example, as Jörg Fakac critiques it. So insofar as man has not inscribed itself into the rock and into the ocean, into the sea, the Anthropocene also installs a new geohistory, she writes, like installing like something like a new universal material identity for all the humans and leading all the trajectory of all peoples into one under dominance of the sign. So she argues that this humanist trick also of becoming post-racial to this anthropocenic speciation, as she names it, also denies the racial dimensions of the Anthropocene and can lead towards a blindness to also the rationalized implications of the climate crisis, like Françoise Verger has argued. And she argues that the Anthropocene obscures also inequalities and violence inscribed in modernity's strategic relations of power and production, and it should be understood as a racial capitalocene. That's her proposal. The term that also highlights that the ecological catastrophes today cannot be understood without this intertwined history, centuries-long exploitations of resources and labor power of beings that are marked as not human or not quite human. So insofar as the Anthropocene is often framed as this moment when we finally know what is happening, or we finally becoming the self-conscious active agent in support of our own life support system, as for example, Stephen Paul Crutzen puts it, it enacts this new divide from the past and continues this logic of progress in a way. Because the staging of the Anthropocene at the moment when we finally know, for example, as the historians Christophe Bourneuil and Jean-Baptiste Passot call the awakening fable. It's like this fable of now we know we are aware of the global consequences of human actions, and that produces this difference between this blind past when we did not know what we did, but now we know, now we can also be this better we who can do something against it. So so in a way, Anthropocene narratives often also perform this cutting of a path from which we cannot cut ourselves off ever again, as also the Anthropocene marks the non-past traces of this destruction of these anthropos. So in the words of Isabel Stengers, she writes, this is exactly what I fear with this Anthropocene thesis. It proposes a future perfect continuous sense, which puts theorists into a very agreeable position because the mess can now be forgotten and swallowed in a continuity that can be theorized in a single shot. Yeah, just to give you some other example, maybe you know it. So there's one proposal that is explicitly committed to progress and sees the Anthropocene also as an opportunity to create a good Anthropocene and a better future. Is that proposal of the eco-modernist? For example, also involving environmental scientist L. Ellis, who writes, stop trying to save the planet, because the Anthropocene is not a crisis, but now this new ecological and geological epoch ripe with human-directed opportunities. So instead of save the future, we can create it, and we can make nature and environment what we want to do, what we want it to be, and formulating something like a good Anthropocene vision and a manifesto. So in addition to the tendency to put the past behind us, another danger of this Anthropocene narrative is also that insofar as the Anthropocene is framed as a universal, something like a new real in which we are all now forced to live in, also formulate something like a one-world story and enacting a universal, seemingly inclusive time. So for example, the philosopher Clive Hamilton writes, that the Anthropocene arrives as the grand narrative to progressively order and explain experience. The universal truth all humanity is obliged to live under a narrative that, like it or not, subsumes all others and against which they will be judged. So, as this totalizing event par excellence, according to Hamilton, every human now is assigned to live with it, in it, and cannot deny it, is defining truth that man has become this conscious force and the creators of all geological forces. So for Hamilton, everyone had to submit to the totality of this one world Anthropocene. And he says that it's not longer an argument appealing to your own culture or religion, because everybody has to submit to what is forced from us and below, and has to finally accept this new reality. And as this new real, this narrative also can acquire, as for example, the philosopher and sociologist Martin Sapkansky describes as a cosmological clearing operation, that the destruction of a multiplicity of worlds that do not want or cannot submit to this one world story of the Anthropocene can only be justified by this narrative of this universal Anthropocene as a total event. So for Hamilton, the Anthropocene heralds a new and universal era. So it's one global culture and one global earth and one global time, he says. So in this sense, Anthropocene can be enacted as a grand universal narrative and can also enact something like a one world world. And this is a term I use from, which is coined by the science technology scholar John Law. And he uses this notion to describe the global north production and stabilization of one single universal reality, on which there would be merely different cultural perspectives, but there is one underlying one world. And thereby, the one world enacts binary differences between like nature and culture, ontology, epistemology, reality and representation. In the science, something like a single universe, which is something like a large space-time box that goes on by itself, and we are all just trying to live in it. But for him, it is not a predetermined common ground, but rather is itself produced in practices that enact the single reality or that enact a one world. So what is violent about this one world is that it sets itself as universal and reduces all other wording practices to a matter of faith, or not a matter of the real of the one world, and excludes or denies them. So the non-world metaphysics, he writes, evacuate reality from non-dominant reals. So this one world in this way can also enact ontological and epistemic violence against all knowledge practices and ways of worlding that do not correspond to this one world. And the doctrine of this one world in this way attempts to mold all other worlds into this one world, and transforming other practices of world making only to different cultural perspectives of this one world. For example, this is what Arturo Escobar writes, who, like other decolonial thinkers, has taken up this term from John Law and discussing it in decolonial theory and also in anthropology. So the doctrine of this one world produces other worlds something like actively as non-existence. And thus, we have to, as Escobar writes, resist the hegemonic operation positing one world, one real, and one possible. So for Law, it is central that the one world is like any other thing, not an underlying ground. So there is no underlying ground, there is no single reality, no universe, or no time given against whose background then afterwards practices happen, he says. But realities and worlds, and it could be added also time, are produced in heterogeneous, performative, and material semiotic practices. So he says there is no overarching, there's nothing outside practices. And practices are not only about people as central actors, like they can perform their time like to one, but about material heterogeneous material relations between connecting and separating. And this has also political consequences because it means that reality in the world and also that time can also be done otherwise and does not have to be that way. Yeah, so based on this term, at least that would be a suggestion that Anthropocene narratives can also serve to enact something like a one-time reality or like a one-time time. And that does not mean that the Anthropocene and also time cannot be done differently, but it can also be done as this one-time time. And how exactly this happens in details and how strategies and indications are given, and that would be certainly to be important to investigate in more detail. I can just share with you today some initial ideas about what this one-time time could maybe mean. So enacting this one-time time would be to stabilize something like a single universal all-encompassing time in which everything is then located and which encompasses something like all possible past, future and present presences. At the same time, it forms something like a single timeline, like an arrow of time moving relentlessly forward into a succession of presents. And while the time ceaselessly makes this cuts between the present and the past. So future would function here as this open field of possibility, and past is something that has no longer an effect. You can't change it. It's closed. It's over. And at the same time, maybe the one-time time can be also used as this principle that there's only one time at one time, to quote Cameron here. So that means that only one time in one time can claim to be present and to be in the presence. It would be determined by operations of binary differentiation, this distinction between before and after, progress and regression, past and future, and also the real and the possible. And in relation to law, describes this nature culture divide as one tactic of the one world, something similar can perhaps be said from this one-time time, because we all agree that there can be multiple temporalities and that there can be general cultural conceptions of time, that there can be something like time regimes who then precede each other and something like that, but we all remain faithful, or in this one-time time logic, we would be made this one time who encompasses all these different temporalities. So now I come to the second part of my talk. So the problem with this formulation can be seen as this new era which enacts this break with the past, and in which the humans are now called upon to create this better future, using our immense power of our intellect or creativity to say with Woodson and Schrading, or moving towards this better Anthropocene with Ellis, is that this gesture also obscures the violence of what, for example, anthropologist Elizabeth Robinelli has called the ancestral catastrophes that keep arriving out of the ground from colonialism and racism, rather than emerging over the horizon of liberal progress. So she writes, the catastrophe of climate change, toxic exposure, and viral pandemics are not avenir. They're not on the horizon coming towards those staring at it. These are the ancestral catastrophes that began with the brutal dispossession of human and modern human worlds, and the vicious extraction of human and modern human labor. These dispossessions and extractions gave birth to liberalism and capitalism, and alongside them a massive machinery that is about the structural violence. So she uses this concept of liberal horizon to refer to a progressive temporality that functions as a tool of late liberalism that brackets forms of violence as merely unintended and accidental consequences of this liberal demographic unfolding. So from the view of these ancestral catastrophes, the Anthropocene means, for Binelli, living in ongoing times of endings and endurance, and she shows in her ongoing scholarly and artistic work with friends and colleagues from indigenous communities in Northern Australia, where she explores this textures of innovation and endurance, also that there are forms of temporality that cannot be captured in the registers of eventfulness, and they're not part of the progressive time, but temporalities of endurance that are also reduced by this violence of late liberalism. So the temporality of ancestral catastrophe is also the temporality of an ongoing colonial duration. That's a term from Ali Al-Zaji, which I will talk about more later, and the temporality of the violence and all kind of dispersed suffering that is not captured in the Popinelli, this eventfulness, imaginary of eventfulness. So this gesture of opening this new chapter, as Hamilton said, and discarding of the past and just be able to move on, it's also can be maybe also bound to a privilege and also wide perspective of those who can also stare at the horizon as something where the catastrophe is to come and not already here. And the world perspective for those for whom the apocalypse is yet to come, and you can always like restart the clock and start anew, and who are not already living in this ongoing aftermath of these catastrophes. So in my second part, I now want to insist on the possibility and also on the urgency to do the past differently. That means different than to this binary cutting off of the past, and thinking of the past not as something that is irrevocably closed and passive and no longer active, and we can't change it, we can't do anything about it, and ask the question, how would it be possible to conceptualize the past as something that is maybe not something like a container of accumulating events where we can't change anything about, but maybe something that is rather incomplete and fragmented and also unfinished or half open, as philosopher Alia Al-Zadi writes. And also in the sense of a past that has yet to be done, as Adia Hartman, a Black Studies thinker, puts it, as something that continues to be at stake, can maybe also claim something on the present, also make a claim on the present as past. So what would it mean to rethink past as maybe something like a matter of care, something that calls on us to respond to it, or with Jacques Derrida, an inheritance that is not given, but also remains before us. And this is insofar important as the past is also a place where aggression is at work, as Alia Al-Zadi highlights. So it is not only that what she calls colonial durations and reformations also are structuring the present, a structuring that has also destructuring effects on differently positioned subjects, but also that the past itself can be fissured and scared by colonial retellings of this past, as she points out. So in order to approach the question of how the past might be done differently, I just want to briefly introduce two reflections of two thinkers. Like I already quoted her, the critical phenomenologist and postcolonial thinker Alia Al-Zadi and the Black Studies thinker Adia Hartman, who both in totally different ways ask about how a coexistence between past and present, or something like a temporal entanglement between past and present, can be thought, and really try to develop some practices of how to reconfigure time and how to undo time, not as something that is maybe a solution or that will save anything, but as practices of care toward the past. Alia Al-Zadi develops this notion of colonial duration as a counter concept also to regressive linear time. And she takes up Henri Bergson's concept of duration, but at the same time, she reworks this concept of duration to refer to the afterlife of colonialism and slavery, and she persists, which also persists in the, as she writes, material embodied effective life of the present, differently for differently positioned subjects. So it refers to the persistence of colonial power latures in the present, but also to the fact that colonial pasts remain in or rather with the present and continue to structure its connections. So it's not duration like a linear flow towards the future, not a linear sequence and not like an undisturbed continuity, but she thinks duration is something that resists the time of progress and carries the past with it in a relational and non-linear way. So contrary to this progressive linear time that leaves behind the past, as completed duration refers to the persistence of the past, it continues to have effects, and that is not completed, but always unfinished and ongoing, as she puts it. So she also speaks of an uneven effective weight of the past, and that the thickness of colonial duration has a radically unequal weight for different position subjects and can be disregarded and then indifferent from wide Eurocentric or S-centric perspectives, she writes, but is intensively structuring for the everyday, for the occupied, racialized, and formerly colonized, as she puts it. So for her, it is central that she does not erase this difference between past and present. They form something like an asymmetric dimension, but are not reducible to each other, but are correlational to each other. So she develops with and reworking Bergson a nonlinear conception of time, where she understands the past as coexisting with the present and as something that can be reconfigured. So she uses this concept of reconfiguration to point towards the possibility that it is possible to reconfigure relations of the past and to hold these seemingly mutually exclusive characteristic that together that the past can be both irreversible but yet nonlinear, both preserved and also reconfigurable, both forgotten and not cease to have an effect. And for her, it's also important that the traces of all the transformations and reconfigurations remains themselves inscribed into the past, whereby inscribed is maybe not the right word, because she argues against this image of a surface that can be rewritten as you wish, but she talks about this image of the past as a dove that can be constantly kneaded and refolded like a dynamic material that contains different regions of text and textures of densities and cracks and fissures, and that it has really limits how you cannot just infinitely reconfigure the past, because it has limits how you can fold it anew. So it's not so she does not speak about the sovereign power of like make from the past as you wish differently, but that the past itself remains fissured and scarred, and so you have to really carefully refold it differently. So she also talks about reconfigurability to really try to create new openings and possibilities in the past, and also insist of traces that what might have been, what could have been. Yes, so it's not, she says that it's not about we can heal it as it was, or we can just close the fissures of the present, of the past, but it's both like a matter of mourning, but also creating different kinds of relations with and in the past. So it's not like this, yeah, not we can just repair past as we want to. Yeah, now I want to come to the practice of Sadiya Hartman, and she is also in several essays and books also engaged with the archive of the Middle Passage, and she searches for ways to care for the lives and death of the enslaved, and for listening, as she says, for the unsaid, and for all the stories that we cannot know and that will never be recovered. So for all of the stories that are not in the archive, but that form something like the plague noise or the silence of the archives, account books, court documents, and diaries, she says. So she tries to account for existences that were so thoroughly wiped out that they cannot occur in the archives and cannot occur inside the past that is recorded, and form somehow impossible past that do not exist in this past, that cannot appear in it, and only the form of their own obliteration. So she, in 3 different texts from her, separated by years, she tries to return again and again to the lives and the murder of 2 specific girls from the board of the slave ship recovery in 1791. And the only traces of these 2 girls consist in documents relating to a parliamentary debate and also a court hearing where the ship's captain was acquitted of the murder. And with that, she also returns to the same present questions anew and asks how would it be possible to recuperate these 2 lives, and as she writes, also to hold these death in our bodies and give them maybe a different way of existing, if their lives are, as she writes, and remain entangled with and impossible to differentiate from the terrible utterances that condemned it to death, the account books that identified them as units of value, and the invoices that claimed them as property, and the banner chronicles that stripped them out of human features. So she says she tries an impossible writing that attempts to say what was this speaking, that simultaneously is written with and also against the archive. A writing in which she approaches that but cannot be known because there was no one there to witness this, the life and existence of these 2 enslaved girls. But how could it be even possible to construct a story from this locus of impossible speech, as she writes, to tell histories that cannot be known and that will never be recovered? So she tries to remake the scraps and fragments of the archive to produce something differently, to produce a different story, and writing differently about these 2 deaths as something like, as she calls it, a counter history of the human, and ask why should this murder of these 2 enslaved girls even matter, one without a name, one called Venus by her white captors. So why would it even matter at all to turn towards these 2 girls after all these years, and how could they even make a claim on the present? So they appear in the archives within the same violence that simultaneously erases them. So there are only a few lines and words as a barrier against the disappearance. And at the same time, these lines, where they appear at all in this world, repeat the violence of their erasure. So everything that can be known about from them comes from the word of their white masters and captors. So in a sense, the archive is also a death sentence, as Hartman writes. And asks, is it even possible to return to these scenes of subjugation without repeating this trauma of this violence? And why expose these dead to new dangers by repeating the violence of this archive? And she tries to undertake this impossible writing of a story that was really predicated on this impossibility, and attempts to say what refuses to be said. It's like a story of an unrecoverable and not retrievable past, a narrative of what might have been or could have been. And she asks also repeatedly, what else is there to say, or how can I say more than this? And in her two different texts, and she insists on this impossibility and also on this necessity to imagine the impossible or possible pre-care and affection and resistance and potentiality in the world of desolation. She says, how can there be forms of life arise under this judgment of death? And she says that because the present makes auto clear outside of the threat of this death, in the ongoing climate of anti-blackness, there is no space in which black mourning cannot protect days, she says. So that the archive of Black Death also continues, and the intimacy with that in the whole also continues to define Black existence, according to Hartman. So the central point of her repeated return to these two girls, at least as I would understand it, is not to find a different narrative about a past that is closed and inert and no longer changeable, like how to tell it differently, even though this what happened when is not concealed, but we can still make the different story of it. Because she writes the past is neither inert nor given in her book Lucy Mother. So she says that if the ghost of slavery still haunts our present, she writes, it is because we are still looking for an exit from the prison. So for her writing is inextricably linked also to a history of the present, in which that what she calls the non-event of emancipation continues, in which Black life in the afterlife of slavery means also to continue to live under the constant threat of death and the exposure to perpetuate acts of violence. And this question of how can we live is also carried forward through times. So with this formulation of this non-event of emancipation, she points out that the abolition of slavery in the US context did not represent this transition from servitude to freedom, but a transformation of practices of domination, while the relationship of structural violence that in a sense remained. And in this sense, there is for her no definitive demarcation of break between slavery and its aftermath. And turning slavery into this historical object, as Calvin Warren describes it, into something that remains locked in the past as we move forward, leaving it behind, also denies the way in which it forms something derived like a venturized, it continues to structure the present, and also Western thought, the way in which the anti-Black epistemes of distinctions between human, non-human, citizen and property, self-ownership and dispossession remain also inscribed, he writes, in the liberal grammar of humanism. So the unfinished past of time of slavery pervades in the present, and also that what Christina Sharp calls the total kind of anti-Blackness. So Hartman speaks of something like an untimely coevalence between the two girls and contemporary Black life under ongoing anti-Black violence. And she writes that, I leave this out, this one. Here in the second part of this quote, but in the meantime, in the space of the interval, between too late and too early, between the no longer and no yet, our lives are coeval with the girls in the as yet incomplete project of freedom. So in the meantime, it is clear that her life and ours hang in the balance. So the past existence of these two girls are not a mere allegory of the present, but the past is as much at stake as the present itself. So Hartman does not approach these two girls as something that is passive forever fixed and can no longer have effect and remain somehow unavailable, but they exercise the claim on the present, she writes, and her writing is also answering this call that still echoes across the Atlantic, as she writes. So in her writing, she carries out an encounter that remains asymmetrical, and in the wild hope, and in the same time, this failure of creating a space-time for them to exist differently, as to hold them in other relations that can counter the violence of their inscription into the archive, and to create a way to endure together, she writes. So maybe her practice is also with Christina Sharp something like a care in the wake, or a wake of caring that does not see past as something completed and available as an object of care, but a caring for an unavailable past that also endures, that this does not cease to be at stake, and that doesn't cease to decompose the present and to have a claim on it. And her writing lingers somehow at this impossible point where she links the maybe changeability of this past also with this non-recoverability of the past and the urgency of, as she writes, a past that has yet to be done. The claim of the unfinished past on the present also with this impossibility of restoration of the past. And I think this is 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, I think that this was my talk. I just thinking about maybe give you a summary, but I just said, but I don't know, maybe we can just first to start the discussion, and then maybe I can clarify a few things, or we can just talk about it. Yeah, thank you so much for hearing me.